Chapter 9 of Outwitting the Hun, My Escape from a German Prison Camp by Pat O'Brien. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. I Enter Belgium. I have said it was about the 18th day after my escape that I entered Belgium, but that is more or less guesswork. I was probably well into that country before I realized that I had crossed the line. About the third day after I figured I was in Belgium, I started to swim a canal just before daylight. I was then heading due north in the direction of the German lines. I was just about to wade into the canal when I heard a German yelling violently, and for the first time I knew I was being followed. I ran up the bank of the canal quite a distance and then swam to the opposite side, as I reasoned they would not be looking for me there. I found a sheltered clump of bushes in a swamp near the canal, and in the driest part that I could find I crawled in and made myself as comfortable as possible. The sun came up soon and kept me warm, and I planned to camp right there, food or no food, until the Huns got tired of searching for me. I think I heard them once or twice that day, and my heart nearly stopped on each occasion, but evidently they decided to look in some other direction, and I was not further molested. At the same time, I figured it was absolutely necessary for me to change my course, even at the expense of going somewhat out of my way. Certainly if I went north they would get me. I decided to go due west, and I kept in that direction for 4 days. As I was in a very weak condition, I did not cover more than 5 miles a night. I kept away from the roads and did all my journeying through fields, beet patches, woods, swamps, anywhere, provided I was not likely to be seen and captured. Food was an important consideration to me, but it was secondary to concealment. At last I brought up at the Meuse River at a place between Namur and Haye, and it was here that I came nearest of all to giving up the struggle. The Meuse at this point is about half a mile wide as the Hudson River at West Point. Had I been in normal condition, I wouldn't have hesitated a moment to swim across it. San Diego Bay, California, is 1.5 miles wide, and I had often swum across and back, and the San Joaquin, which is also 1.5 miles wide, had never proved an obstacle to me. In the wretched shape in which I then was, however, the Meuse looked like the Atlantic Ocean to me. I looked for a boat, but could find none. I tried to get a piece of wood upon which I hoped to ferry across, but I was equally unsuccessful. Get across I must, and I decided there was nothing to do but swim it. It was then about 3 o'clock in the morning. I waded in and was soon in beyond my depth and had to swim. After about an hour of it, I was very much exhausted, and I doubted whether I could make the opposite bank, although it was not more than 30 or 40 feet away. I choked and gasped, and my arms and legs were completely fagged out. I sank a little and tried to touch bottom with my feet, but the water was still beyond my depth. There are times when every one will pray, and I was no exception. I prayed for strength to make those few wicked yards, and then, with all the will power I could summon, struck out for dear life. It seemed a lifetime before I finally felt the welcome mud of bottom and was able to drag myself up to the bank, but I got there. The bank was rather high, and I was shaking so violently that when I took hold of the grass to pull myself up, the grass shook out of my hands. I could not retain my grip. I was afraid I would faint then and there, but I kept pulling and crawling frantically up that infernal bank and finally made it. Then, for the first time in my life, I fainted from utter exhaustion. It was now about 4 o'clock in the morning, and I was entirely unprotected from observation. If any one had come along, I would have been found lying there dead to the world. Possibly 2 hours passed before I regained consciousness, and then, no doubt, only because the rain was beating in my face. I knew that I had to get away, as it was broad daylight. Moreover, there was a tow path right there, and any minute a boat might come along and find me. but it was equally dangerous for me to attempt to travel very far. Fortunately, I found some shrubbery near by, and I hid there all day without food or drink. That night I made a little headway, but when day broke I had a dreadful fever and was delirious. I talked to myself and thereby increased my chances of capture. In my lucid intervals, when I realized that I had been talking, the thought sent a chill through me, because in the silent night even the slightest sound carries far across the Belgian country. I began to fear that another day of this would about finish me. I have a distinct recollection of a ridiculous conversation I carried on with an imaginary Pat O'Brien, a sort of duplicate of myself. I argued with him as I marched drearily along, and he answered me back in kind, and when we disagreed I called upon my one constant friend, the North Star, to stand by me. "There you are, you old North Star!" I cried aloud. "You want me to get to Holland, don't you? But this Pat O'Brien, who calls himself a soldier, he's got a yellow streak. North Star! And he says it can't be done. He wants me to quit, to lie down here for the Huns to find me and take me back to Courtrai. After all you've done, North Star, to lead me to liberty. Won't you make this coward leave me, North Star? I don't want to follow him. I just want to follow you, because you are taking me away from the Huns, and this Pat O'Brien, this fellow who keeps after me all the time and leans on my neck and wants me to lie down, this yellow Pat O'Brien wants me to go back to the Huns." After a spell of foolish chatter like that, my senses would come back to me for a while, and I would trudge along without a word until the fever came on me again. I knew that I had to have food because I was about on my last legs. I was very much tempted to lie down then and there and call it a heat. Things seemed to be getting worse for me the farther I went, and all the time I had before me the specter of that electric barrier between Belgium and Holland, even if I ever reached there alive. What was the use of further suffering when I would probably be captured in the end anyway? Before giving up, however, I decided upon one bold move. I would approach one of the houses in the vicinity and get food there or die in the effort. I picked out a small house because I figured there would be less likelihood of soldiers being billeted there. Then I wrapped a stone in my khaki handkerchief as a sort of camouflaged weapon, determined to kill the occupant of the house, German or Belgian, if that step were necessary in order to get food. I tried the well in the yard, but it would not work, and then I went up to the door and knocked. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. An old lady came to the window and looked out. She could not imagine what I was, probably because I was still attired in that old overcoat. She gave a cry, and her husband and a boy came to the door. They could not speak English, and I could not speak Flemish, but I pointed to my flying coat and then to the sky and said "Vlieger," flyer, which I thought would tell them what I was. Whether they understood or were intimidated by my hard-looking appearance, I don't know. But certainly it would have to be a brave old man and boy who would start an argument with such a villainous-looking character as stood before them that night. I had not shaved for a month, my clothes were wet, torn, and dirty, my leggings were gone, they had got so heavy I had discarded them, my hair was matted, and my cheeks were flushed with fever. In my hand I carried the rock in my handkerchief, and I made no effort to conceal its presence or its mission. Anyway, they motioned me indoors and gave me my first hot meal in more than a month. True, it consisted only of warm potatoes. They had been previously cooked, but the old woman warmed them up in milk in one of the dirtiest kettles I had ever seen. I asked for bread, but she shook her head, although I think it must have been for lack of it rather than because she begrudged it to me. For if ever a man showed he was famished, I did that night. I swallowed those warm potatoes ravenously, and I drank 4 glasses of water, one after another. It was the best meal I had had since the banquet in the prison at Courtrai. The woman of the house was probably 75 years old, and had evidently worn wooden shoes all her life, for she had a callous spot on the side of her foot the size of $50, and it looked so hard that I doubt whether you could have driven a nail into it with a hammer. As I sat there drying myself, for I was in no hurry to leave the first human habitation I had entered in 4 weeks, I reflected on my unhappy lot, and the unknown troubles and dangers that lay ahead of me. Here, for more than a month, I had been leading the life of a hunted animal. Yes, worse than a hunted animal, for nature clothes her less favored creatures more appropriately for the life they lead than I was clothed for mine, and there was not the slightest reason to hope that conditions would grow better. Perhaps the first warm food I had eaten for over a month had released unused springs of philosophy in me, as food sometimes does for a man. I pointed to my torn and water-soaked clothes and conveyed to them as best I could that I would be grateful for an old suit, but apparently they were too poor to have more than they actually needed themselves, and I rose to go. I had roused them out of bed, and I knew I ought not to keep them up longer than was absolutely necessary. As I approached the door, I got a glance of myself in a mirror. I was the awfulest sight I had ever laid eyes on. The glimpse I got of myself startled me almost as much as if I had seen a dreaded German helmet. My left eye was fairly well healed by this time, and I was beginning to regain the sight of it, but my face was so haggard and my beard so long and unkempt that I looked like Santa Claus on a bat. As they let me out of the door, I pointed to the opposite direction to the one I intended taking and started off in the direction I had indicated. Later I changed my course completely to throw off any possible pursuit. The next day I was so worn out from exposure and exhaustion that I threw away my coat, thinking that the less weight I had to carry, the better it would be for me. But when night came I regretted my mistake, because the nights were now getting colder. I thought at first it would be best for me to retrace my steps and look for the coat I had so thoughtlessly discarded, but I decided to go on without it. I then began to discard everything that I had in my pocket, finally throwing my wrist watch into a canal. A wrist watch does not add much weight, but when you plod along and have not eaten for a month, it finally becomes rather heavy. The next thing I discarded was a pair of flying mittens. These mittens I had got at Camp Borden in Canada, and had become quite famous, as my friends termed them snowshoes. In fact, they were a ridiculous pair of mittens, but the best pair I ever had, and I felt really worse when I lost those mittens than anything else. I could not think of anybody else ever using them, so I dug a hole in the mud and buried them, and could not help but laugh at the thought of what my friends would say had they seen me burying my mittens, because they were a standing joke in Canada, England, and France. I had on 2 shirts, and as they were always both wet and didn't keep me warm, it was useless to wear both. One of these was a shirt that I had bought in France, the other an American Army shirt. They were both khaki, and one as apt to give me away as the other, so I discarded the French shirt. The American Army shirt I brought back with me to England, and it is still in my possession. When I escaped from the train, I still had that Bavarian cap of bright red in my pocket and wore it for many nights, but I took great care that no one saw it. It also had proved very useful when swimming rivers, for I carried my map and a few other belongings in it, and I had fully made up my mind to bring it home as a souvenir. But the farther I went, the heavier my extra clothing became, so I was compelled to discard even the cap. I knew it would be a telltale mark if I simply threw it away, so one night after swimming a river I dug a hole in the soft mud on the bank and buried it, too, with considerably less ceremony than my flying mittens had received, perhaps, and that was the end of my Bavarian hat. My experience at the Belgian's house whetted my appetite for warm food, and I figured that what had been done once could be done again. Sooner or later, I realized, I would probably approach a Belgian and find a German instead, but in such a contingency I was determined to measure my strength against the Huns if necessary to effect my escape. As it was, however, most of the Belgians to whom I applied for food gave it to me readily enough, and if some of them refused me it was only because they feared I might be a spy or that the Germans would shoot them if their action were subsequently found out. About the 5th day after I had entered Belgium, I was spending the day as usual in a clump of bushes, when I discerned in the distance what appeared to be something hanging on a line. All day long I strained my eyes trying to decide what it could be and arguing with myself that it might be something that I could add to my inadequate wardrobe, but the distance was so great that I could not identify it. I had a great fear that before night came it would probably be removed. As soon as darkness fell, however, I crawled out of my hiding place and worked up to the line and got a pair of overalls for my industry. It was a mighty joyful night for me. That pair of overalls was the first bit of civilian clothes I had thus far picked up, with the exception of a civilian cap which I had found at the prison and concealed on my person and which I still had. The overalls were rather small and very short, but when I put them on I found that they hung down far enough to cover my breeches. It was perhaps 3 days later that I planned to search another house for further clothes. Entering Belgian houses at night is anything but a safe proposition because their families are large and sometimes as many as 7 or 8 sleep in a single room. The barn is usually connected with the house proper, and there was always the danger of disturbing some dumb animal, even if the inmates of the house were not aroused. Frequently I took a chance of searching a back yard at night in the hope of finding food scraps, but my success in that direction was so slight that I soon decided it wasn't worth the risk, and I continued to live on the raw vegetables that I could pick with safety in the fields and the occasional meal that I was able to get from the Belgian peasants in the daytime. Nevertheless, I was determined to get more in the way of clothing, and when night came I picked out a house that looked as though it might furnish me with what I wanted. It was a moonlit night, and if I could get in the barn I could have a fair chance of finding my way around by the moonlight which would enter the windows. The barn adjoined the main part of the house, but I groped around very carefully, and soon I touched something hanging on a peg. I didn't know what it was, but I confiscated it and carried it out into the fields. There in the moonlight I examined my booty and found it was an old coat. It was too short as an overcoat and too long for an ordinary coat, but nevertheless I made use of it. It had probably been an overcoat for the Belgian who had worn it. Some days later I got a scarf from a Belgian peasant, and with this equipment I was able to conceal my uniform entirely. Later on, however, I decided that it was too dangerous to keep the uniform on anyway, and when night came I dug a hole and buried it. I never realized until I had to part with it just how much I thought of that uniform. It had been with me through many hard trials, and I felt as if I were abandoning a friend when I parted with it. I was tempted to keep the wings off the tunic, but thought that that would be a dangerous concession to sentiment in the event that I was ever captured. It was the only distinction I had left, as I had given the Royal Flying Corps badges and the stars of my rank to the German flying officers as souvenirs, but I felt that it was safer to discard it. As it finally turned out, through all my subsequent experiences, my escape would never have been jeopardized had I kept my uniform, but of course I had no idea what was in store for me. There was one thing which surprised me very much as I journeyed through Belgium, and that was the scarcity of dogs. Apparently most of them had been taken by the Germans, and what are left are beasts of burden who are too tired at night to bark or bother intruders. This was a mighty good thing for me, for I would certainly have stirred them up in passing through back yards, as I sometimes did when I was making a short cut. One night, as I came out of a yard, it was so pitch dark I could not see 10 feet ahead of me, and I was right in the back of a little village, although I did not know it. I crawled along, fearing I might come to a crossroads at which there would in all probability be a German sentry. My precaution served me in good stead, for I had come out in the main street of a village, and within 20 feet of me, sitting on some bricks where they were building a little store, I could see the dim outline of a German spiked helmet. I could not cross the street, and the only thing to do was to backtrack. It meant making a long detour and losing 2 hours of precious time and effort, but there was no help for it, and I plodded wearily back, cursing the Huns at every step. The next night, while crossing some fields, I came to a road. It was one of the main roads of Belgium and was paved with cobblestones. On these roads you can hear a wagon or horse about a mile or two away. I listened intently before I moved ahead, and hearing nothing, concluded that the way was clear. As I emerged from the field and got my first glimpse of the road, I got the shock of my life. In either direction, as far as I could see, the road was lined with German soldiers. What they were doing in that part of Belgium I did not know, but you can be mighty sure I didn't spend any time trying to find out. Again it was necessary to change my course and lose a certain amount of ground, but by this time I had become fairly well reconciled to these reverses, and they did not depress me as much as they had at first. At this period of my adventure, if a day or a night passed without its thrill, I began to feel almost disappointed, but such disappointments were rather rare. One evening, as I was about to swim a canal about 200 feet wide, I suddenly noticed, about 100 yards away, a canal boat moored to the side. It was a sort of out-of-the-way place, and I wondered what the canal boat had stopped for. I crawled up to see. As I neared the boat, 5 men were leaving it, and I noticed them cross over into the fields. At a safe distance I followed them, and they had not gone very far before I saw what they were after. They were committing the common but heinous crime of stealing potatoes. Without the means to cook them, potatoes didn't interest me a bit, and I thought that the boat itself would probably yield me more than the potato patch. Knowing that the canal hands would probably take their time in the fields, I climbed up the stern of the boat leisurely and without any particular pains to conceal myself. Just as my head appeared above the stern of the boat, I saw, silhouetted against the sky, the dreaded outline of a German soldier, spiked helmet and all. A chill ran down my spine as I dropped to the bank of the canal and slunk away. Evidently the sentry had not seen me, or if he had probably figured that I was one of the foraging party. But I realized that it wouldn't pay in future to take anything for granted. Chapter 10.